hosting us here, and to the Catharsis organization overall, and to Neil for organizing. And of course, thank you all for coming out to listen to me speak. My name is Eric Stevenson. I'm a community organizer in West Baltimore, and I'm going to be talking about development without displacement, how to use the 10 principles of Burning Man as a guide to avoid gentrification in urban redevelopment. My background is, so as I mentioned, I'm a community organizer in West Baltimore. Two of the organizations that I'm involved with are the Sandtown South Neighborhood Alliance, which is a community neighborhood association in Sandtown, which is one of Baltimore's infamously most disinvested communities. And I'm also a part of the No Boundaries Coalition, which is a community-led nonprofit advocacy group in central West Baltimore. That's organized around the issues of public safety, police accountability, food justice, which is bringing healthy food access into food deserts, and Get Out the Vote, which is an effort to increase voter turnout in our district, which we're proud to brag we doubled in the last election cycle. So how did I come to be a community organizer in West Baltimore? That's not my background, actually. My background is in construction management, which is where I work professionally. So often when I talk about gentrification, people assume that I'm anti-development, and the truth is I'm not. That's actually the industry that I work in. But what I'm for is responsible development and keeping in mind all the people that are affected by development. So that's a little bit what I want to talk about today. So part of the reason that I'm here talking to you fine folks is because hopefully you know a little bit about the 10 principles of Burning Man. And as I mentioned, I don't have any formal education or experience in community organizing. But when I started doing it, what I found was the skills I developed in the Burning Man community as a theme camp organizer were a lot of the same skills and tools that I was able to apply to community development to help rebuild my neighborhood in an inclusive way. So I bought my house in Sandtown in 2015, which is the same year that the unrest in Baltimore kind of put Sandtown on the map, and unfortunately not in a good way. So what was I thinking buying a house in a neighborhood that was just made famous for riots a couple months earlier? Well, the opportunist in me thought things could only go up from there, right? But, you know, I didn't want to be, but I wanted to be welcomed in the community, and I didn't want to be viewed as a gentrifier. I wanted to rebuild the community in an inclusive way. So, so that's where I was able to apply the 10 principles to some of the work that I was doing. A little bit about gentrification. What is gentrification? This is something that comes up a lot. Now, this is just the Merriam-Webster definition, and I swear I didn't cherry pick this definition for the presentation. This is just what Google says. Gentrification is the process of renovating and improving a house or district so that it conforms to middle-class taste, or the process of making a person or activity more refined or polite. So I thought that's really interesting because, you know, some people think of gentrification to be just change, and some people think that gentrification is inevitable. It's just economics, right? But in order to really understand what's happening in these communities, we have to understand the historical context and how a lot of these communities that need help, how they came to be that way. And it's not by accident. And when you understand the context of, you know, public policy and biased development that created these disinvested communities, you realize that there's a moral imperative for people with means and with access and with the ability to correct these historical wrongs. So as I mentioned before, when I came to the community as an outsider, as someone who, with a college education and a middle-class income that was raised in the suburbs, not from Baltimore, who am I to come in and try to change this community? So to the 10 principles. I'm going to go through one by one and talk about how they apply to community organizing. And the first one is radical inclusion. Existing communities want to be included in the future planning of their communities, and not just in a token way. They really want to actually be involved. The problem with gentrification is that while some people see development and economic progress, it's often not progress for the people that are there. The progress is accomplished by moving in a new demographic of people, not correcting the social problems that created these communities in the first place. So to have positive development without displacement and to avoid gentrification, you have to improve things for the people that are already in the community. But not just in a charitable way from the outside. People aren't looking for handouts and donations. People want to be empowered. So you have to include the people in the community in the process. And, when we talk about radical inclusion, it's not just open-mindedness. It's radical. It's a level beyond that. So you really have to get every single person's perspective. That person that is sitting on the corner with nothing to do, they may have been sitting on that corner longer than I've been alive, and while they may not seem like a productive member of the community, their opinion and their perspective still matters. And I've been humbled by how much I've been able to learn from just talking to people in the neighborhood, the type of stuff that they don't teach you in school. The second principle, gifting. So you have to give what you can afford to give to foster a sense of community. It's not a quid pro quo. A lot of people are always want to know what they're going to get in return for something, and if that's the attitude that you approach community development, you're not going to be welcomed and you're going to be disappointed. Part of my privilege of being having a college education and a middle-class income is that I'm, able to contribute to things. So if it's, buying pizza for a community meeting, or, buying shovels for a volunteer day in the garden, that's something that I'm glad to do to facilitate the building of community. So if, more people came with that gifting mentality, the community would have a lot more resources to support itself. Decommodification, and this is really one of the biggest ones, as it is one of the biggest principles in the Burning Man community. So one of the biggest problems, biggest issues that drives gentrification is the commodification of housing. Which is, drives up the price of housing and forces people out of these communities. The problem with that displacement is it erases the culture that accumulates in communities over generations. There's always an undertone of race when you talk about gentrification. And as uncomfortable as that is to talk about sometimes, it really isn't talked about enough. Because whenever we talk about class and economics, we know that what we're really talking about is race. When you look at communities that famously have been gentrified, like the Bay Area on the West Coast, Brooklyn in New York, Washington, D.C., and now parts of Philadelphia where I used to live, the inverse indicator that tracks with economic increase is a decrease in the percentage of Black people. So in many ways, gentrification really is a war on Black communities, and that is very much reflected when we go back to that Merriam-Webster definition. The process of renovating and improving a district so that it conforms to middle-class taste. we can substitute that as a code word for whiteness. So decommodifying housing is important because affordable housing is a right. Everyone deserves a place to live. Again, in the historical context, these communities have been disinvested to drive real estate prices down, and then investors come in and buy them up and then raise the prices so that the people who are surviving in the neighborhood can no longer afford to live there, and those developers extract all of the profit, and then it's no longer affordable. And this is a cycle that we've seen over and over. So decommodification of housing is something that needs to happen at the legislative level to make affordable housing more tenable economically. And also on the social level, we have to demand affordable housing because only then will we get it. Radical self-reliance. Communities don't want outside people to come in and revitalize their communities. They want to do the work themselves. They want to be empowered to do that work. It's a misconception that there is not talent in a lot of these communities. There are architects and professionals, as well as there are skilled laborers and even unskilled laborers that want to be and deserve to be involved in the process. And what I've seen through the many community meetings and outreach meetings that I've participated in is these are often only token gestures where, they hold a meeting, maybe people come, maybe they don't, and they say, we got community input, and then they bring in a developer from out of town or out of state who brings in workers from out of town, out of state to do the work. And the state of the city looks at that as they spent money in that community, and that's a good thing. But what's really needed is the economic multiplier effect of actually spending that money, not just on the community, but in the community. And that means using community businesses, community services, and things like that. And if those services don't exist, that means building capacity. So that means training people and supporting, local nonprofit institutions, not corporate nonprofit institutions that are on the grassroots level. Because as I mentioned, the economic multiplier effect of one, creating jobs in the community and also involving the people in the process creates a more successful result that people are invested in and people are bought into. And then they're much more likely to support and sustain that vision when they're involved. Radical self-expression. Another problematic thing with gentrification is the erasure of culture and image. Again, going from the existing urban culture to a more middle-class culture or whiter culture. It's important, and this is something that I recognized as someone moving into the neighborhood, to respect the existing people and culture. If that culture is a street corner social culture where that's the town square and people, hang out there and gather there, that shouldn't be seen as a nuisance. That is actually can be seen as a community asset, because what we have less and less of is public spaces where people can come together and exchange ideas and build community. So, the gathering of local people who are most often black as a threat is one of the ways that racist and white supremacist viewpoints are kind of baked into our policies, the way we police our neighborhoods, the way we report the evening news, and the way we develop our communities. And only by recognizing that are we ever going to be able to change that. So, radical self-expression in this context is not criminalizing people for being themselves, which is too often what we see in urban revitalization efforts. Not to go on a tangent here, but for the longest time, urban revitalization, what we saw through the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s was slum clearing, where they would come in and bulldoze entire neighborhoods because they were not nice places. But again, you have to remember how those slums were created and what happens to the people that live there. I'll come back to that at the end. Communal effort. I touched on this a little bit, but you have to work together with all stakeholders in the community and get everyone on board with whatever changes you want to make in that community. And that's not always the easiest way to get things done. As a project manager, I'll tell you, that's not always the quickest way to get things done. That's not always the most efficient way to get things done. But it's important. You have to bring everyone along with you. It's not just a race to the finish line, because you don't win the race if you leave everybody in the dust behind you. So, bringing the community along and getting everyone on board could sometimes be a long, slow, painful, and maybe even more expensive process. But it's important to get that buy-in. It's important for the long-term success of any vision you're trying to implement, and it's really just the right thing to do. Civic responsibility. This sort of starts to tie it all together. You want to do the most good. And a lot of times, people who will argue with me about these ideals will, quote the written letter of the law, and they'll make economic arguments, and they'll say, well, why can't I do this? I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm within my rights. I deserve to make a profit. It's their fault that, they're experiencing economic hardship. Any lawyer could make any one of those arguments, but at the end of the day, we have a civic responsibility to improve our communities for the people. Communities are not buildings, they're not coffee shops, they're not dog parks, they're people. So unless we're improving the lives of the people, we're not improving communities, and that's what we have a civic responsibility to do. Leave no trace. This one's in a slightly different spirit than the other 9 principles in how it applies, because leave no trace is one of the most special things, in my opinion, about burner culture, and it was one of the most transformative things for me to learn and to bring into my life, just changing the way that we think about and view trash and waste in our society and in our lives. We see a lot of trash and litter and blight in these communities. And you'll even see, people that live in those communities throw trash on the ground. And so then it becomes easy to, blame people for their own conditions because they created those conditions, right? But it's really a culture and educational thing. I think about how far I've come on the leave no trace front in my understanding of trash and waste since my exposure to the Burning Man community. And that's really an opportunity for me and for us to educate and to teach and to share our culture with a community that could really benefit from that outlook and from that knowledge. Participation. I knew that when I got into this that I was going to have to do the work. The difference I like to think, the difference between me and many real estate investors or speculators and the difference in the decision that I made in 2015 to invest in this community is I knew that things weren't going to improve all by themselves. Property values weren't going to just start going up. Crime wasn't just going to magically go down, and things weren't going to change overnight. But I saw work that needed to be done, and I wanted to be the one to do it. So there's a lot of opportunity for people if your heart is in the right place and you really want to do the work to participate in the revitalization of these communities. And that's what really is needed, is people on the ground level to get their hands dirty, not just throw money at things, although, funding's always nice too. And the final principle is immediacy. There is an affordable housing crisis in this country, in every city in this country, and even, spreading across suburban and rural America with the housing boom of 10 years ago and the recovery since. Housing prices are at an all-time high in many of our cities. Washington, D.C. is no exception. Philadelphia is no exception. And then, places that we're all familiar with, like the Bay Area and Brooklyn. So, if we don't do something about these issues soon, the problems are only going to get worse. And that's why I'm really glad to be in the position that I am and doing the work that I am, because it's been really rewarding, and I think that there's plenty to do. So let me just make sure I didn't miss anything. With that, I'll take any questions. Yes.
How has your work changed you?
So growing up in suburban New Jersey, I, was not always a social justice person. I was not always really cognizant of some of the race issues that are so prevalent in this country. And, part of that was moving from a somewhat progressive place, northern New Jersey, to a surprisingly less progressive Baltimore City, and that really changed my outlook. But also when I moved to the community and wanted to genuinely be part of the community, I realized that my opinion and my perspective wasn't necessarily the most important, that I really needed to understand my neighbors and see things from their perspective and advocate for them first, even if it's not always in line with some of my traditional views. Yes?
You talked about civic responsibility, and you talked about people who say, well, I have a right to make profit. And building off of what you just said about how the individual's opinion and perspective can't be the anchor point if you want to have a greater effect. Have you found a way to communicate with people who, despite their desire to leap racial bounds and leap economic boundaries, still have that economic bottom line and find themselves restricted in reaching out? How do you communicate with people who say, but I still have the right to make a profit?
Right. It's hard. At the end of the day, this is still America, and things that are not economically viable tend to not happen. So it's you asked how, but the first step is communication. So, bringing those people to the table. And there's a huge disconnect, I've found, at least in West Baltimore, between business owners and the community. For the most part, and this is the fine line that we walk when we talk about, improving communities, but to the benefit of the community, you need to attract business owners and development to these communities. I believe strongly in that, and that's why I've kind of found this cause, because as a construction professional and also a community representative, I think I'm uniquely qualified to bridge that gap. But it's really, I want to give you two answers. On the small business side, it's just you got to find people with their heart in the right place. And if we support businesses from the community instead of expecting people from outside of the community to do things out of the good of their heart, I mean, that's not really going to happen. But someone who's invested in the community has a motive to enrich the community first, and not lose money, but not hold the bottom line in the highest regard. On the larger scale, when we talk about big development, it's an issue of policy, and our city and our state legislators need to incentivize responsible, community-driven development and small businesses in the same way that they incentivize big business and big developers. I hope that answers your question.
Yes.
And yes.
If you're moving into a new community, and like I'm actually moving to Brooklyn in a couple of weeks, and you want to make sure you're supporting local businesses beyond like going around and talking to people and finding out how long a business is there. Are there resources that like organizers have put together to make a list of more local businesses in a neighborhood? Do you know?
So that's a really interesting question, and it's a hard one. So I can speak to Baltimore specifically, where there are a lot of initiatives, both on the buy local initiatives, like Buy Baltimore, and then also in like housing and real estate initiatives to try to sell houses and bring people into communities. But what we find when we look at those programs is there's usually extreme bias in the people who get involved and get supported by those programs. So you're almost inadvertently could even be exacerbating the problem. The number one thing I would recommend is to go to community meetings and just meet your neighbors. What I've found most surprising is a lot of the stuff that I read online, popular opinions, are not the things that I hear when I actually talk to my neighbors. So, there's a lot of, Facebook know-it-alls that don't actually go and knock on doors and listen to people. So that's the thing that I would stress the most. In your case, unfortunately, like, a lot of that damage has already been done, right? And so that's another reason that this is a really interesting topic for me and for us, because you all, my peers, are at in an interesting position to do either a lot of good or a lot of harm. Because, for example, I went to college in Philadelphia, which at the time was a really rough neighborhood. I lived just off of campus because the rent was cheaper. And I always wanted to buy one of these old houses and fix it up. And when I eventually moved to Baltimore, the property was even cheaper, and I finally got the opportunity to do that. But by this time, I had become more aware of some of the implicit, unintentional repercussions of gentrification. So, on the one hand, just by supporting that economy, paying the higher rent, we are supporting and exacerbating that process. But what can we do? And the only thing that we can do is, once we get into those communities, to be voices for preservation and be allies to the existing community members, if there are any left.
Yeah.
Yes.
So in cases where the damage has already been done, in places like places like Brooklyn or Portland, Oregon, where I'm from, how do we use our